Okay. Thank you very much for inviting me to give this talk. Many apologize for my very bad English. It is due to a birth defect because I wasn't born in England. That's why I put the turtleneck in the British style in order to improve my accent. Okay, so the influence that philosophy had on Lacan is widely known. But this evening, I'd like to focus my talk on a precise point, that is to say, the early influence on Lacan of Kojève's thought, and maybe also of the thinkers of the so-called Frankfurt School. Let me begin with the importance of the encounter between Jacques Lacan and Alexandre Kojève. This encounter was so important that Lacan considered Kojève as his only master, as we can read in a dedication from Lacan to Kojève in the 60s, where Lacan writes « Pour Kojève, qui fut mon maître, vraiment le seul », for Kojève, my teacher, in brackets, really the only one. Lacan, like many other intellectuals, including Georges Bataille, Raymond Queneau, Michel Leiris, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, and many others, regularly attended Kojève's lectures on Hegel in the 30s at the École pratique des hautes études in Paris. Let me begin with a very known text of Lacan entitled Les complexes familiaux, family complex. In the 1938, in his article Family Complex, published in French Encyclopedia, Lacan presented at least two theses, that is to say, one, the mirror stage, and two, the diagnosis of the decline of father figure as a condition of the invention of psychoanalysis. Concerning these two aspects, I discovered two things. First, I discovered at the National Library in Paris some letters from Lacan to Kojève dated in 1935. So at the same time that he attends Kojève lectures on Hegel. These few letters are finally published in many languages, Italian, English, French, etc. The second discovery concerns the Lacanian diagnosis of the decline of the father figure. For a long time, people considered that it was a very original thesis of Lacan. That is to say, the decline of father figure as a condition not only of the birth of psychoanalysis, but even as a condition of the modern neurosis. There can be no neurosis in the modern sense without this historical contingency. It is very interesting because, as you know, maybe, Lacan is not a historicist author. He doesn't believe that historical conditions could have an influence on the unconscious. In this sense, the diagnosis of the decline of father figure would be in contradiction in a way with his later work, namely after the 50s and his encounter with Claude Lévi-Strauss thought, structuralism, and so on and so forth. In fact, I discovered, reading the original edition of Family Complex, the original edition simply because in the official one there is no a bibliography, I discovered that Lacan quoted a text of Max Horkheimer entitled Authority and Family, published in 1936, so 2 years before Lacan's publication, Family Complex. Indeed, Horkheimer, the chief of Frankfurt School at that time, write exactly this, I quote, decline of paternal authority as a cause of discomfort, malaise, in modern times, end of quote, in modern times, end of quote. So Lacan says exactly the same things as Horkheimer. I quote Lacan: a great number of psychological effects in modern times seems to us to be a social decline of paternal imago. This decline is conditioned by the return on the individual of the extreme effect of social progress, a decline that is especially marked today in the communities most affected by these effects: economic concentration, political catastrophes, etc. End of quote. Why this discovery would be important? Because Horkheimer published in 1955 a text with Adorno, Dialectic of Enlightenment, in which he put in relation Kant with Sade, so the same thing that Lacan made in 1963 in this article, Kant with Sade. So after this publication of Frankfurt School author. So it's not very clear if Lacan knew really this publication of Horkheimer and Adorno, but the question is a true question. But let me continue with another aspect, my first starting point, that is to say, the mirror stage. I'd like to mention an important point that I feel is essential to a better understanding of the impact of the encounter with Kojève on the formation of the early Lacan. Lacan presented his famous mirror stage in 1936 at an international conference in Marienbad, at the same time as he was attending Kojève's course. This presentation was partially reproduced in a 1938 publication in one of the chapters of the French encyclopedia devoted to mental life, donc the famous family complex. Let me straight away that the observations on which Lacan based his outline of the mirror stage comes directly from Henri Wallon, the very known psychologist and physician, professor of the very prestigious Collège de France. But what is the mirror stage? It is a kind of apologue which, by describing the behavior of a toddler between 6 and 18 months of age in front of the mirror, allow us to understand how children build their personalities. For Lacan, the baby lacks motor and psychological coordination. He is fragmented. That is the key word, morcellement, fragmentation. It's through the image he finds in a mirror, his own image or that of others, that he obtains a semblance of himself, bodily unity that stabilizes him, her psyche. That's all, and that's no bad, considering that for half a century now, cognitive psychologists have been confirming in one way or another this model fashioned by Lacan in the 30s. But the question is, does Kojève's course have a direct impact on this split conception of the human being, namely in the childhood? That is the question. Well, we can easily demonstrate that Lacan's famous mirror stage stems from a cross reading of two authors, Henri Wallon and Alexandre Kojève. In his introduction to the reading of Hegel, Kojève, when demonstrating the passage from simple sensation to more structured perception in the human being, Kojève writes in French, à ce stade, l'être est morcelé. I translate, at this stage, the passage from sensation to structured perception, being is fragmented. But Kojève continues like that, because his reconstruction of Hegel's phenomenology of the spirit implies stages. In these stages, he refers specifically to the child, I quote, c'est l'attitude cognitive de l'homme naïf à l'état exclusif de l'enfant en bas âge. I translate, this is the cognitive attitude of the naive man in its exclusive state of the infant. End of quote. In short, I assume that the co-presence of notions such as A, notion of stage in Kojève, mirror stage in Lacan. B, the notion of the childhood in Kojève, quote, baby in Lacan. And C, the notion of fragmentation in Kojève, same word in Lacan, seems to me to be more than the products of chance. Second point, the notion of desire. One of Kojève's key concepts is, you certainly know that, the notion of desire. The object of the desire of the human being is another desire and not another object. In this sense, the notion of desire corresponds to a notion of the mediation. Kojève considers desire essentially as a mediation. It is through the desire of another that my desire can exist. That is, not only manifests itself, but also comes into being as a human desire. More or less, you understand, I hope. Different, so, from animal desire or the simple immediate desire for something, even in the vital sense, need of food or something. The Kojèvian legacy is also found in Lacan, for whom desire is one of the key terms in his conception of psychoanalysis. Kojève so criticizes desire as the desire for something, because this condition seems satisfactory to him in animals, but not in humans. Thus, he makes clear that humans live in the social world, and they can only are in the social world through a mediation, desire. If you think about what happens, namely in autism, you can realize that an autistic person is not someone who doesn't speak or has not friends, etc., but rather someone in whom the mediation of the desire of the other was not present in early childhood. Allow me to quote Kojève, the desire that relates to another desire will therefore create a new desire. This new desire doesn't exist as such in autism, for example. Human desire must be about another desire, wrote Kojève in 1939. Here too, it's hard not to see the connection with Lacan's statement that desire is the desire of the other, desire independently of the thing desired, since the latter can only be secondary. There is a very interesting point here about Kojève and Wallon, because given that it's very clear that Wallon's observations were the clinical and theoretical basis for the text of the mirror stage, it's very strange that Lacan never mentions a very important point made by Wallon, and especially because these clinical features confirms Kojève's assertion about desires as mediation. I quote Wallon. The child from Darwin, Charles Darwin, the child for Darwin smiles at the image of himself in the eyes, but he turns back in surprise when he hears him talking behind his back. And Wallon points out it was approximately the same time that various observers noted for the first time in children this gesture of turning toward the person whose image they see in the mirror. End of quote. It seems to me interesting because precisely Lacan doesn't mention this gesture in the text of the Mirror Stage in 1938. However, he gave it a crucial importance in the 60s until a point that he considers that if the child is not able to check back that the other when he's in front of the mirror, he's finished, he's psychotic. In this sense, allow me to quote the following two references from the Seminar of the Anxiety, Seminar de l'Angoisse, in English, anxiety is a medical stuff bullshit, anxiety, but anxiety. English copy, page 32, translated by my friend Adrian Price, Lacan. When the child is in front of the mirror, this movement is so frequent that each and every one of you may have some recollection of it. Namely, he turns round to the one supporting him who's there behind him. With this movement of the head, he seems to be asking the one supporting him and who here represent the big other. And further, Lacan's ad, page 120, English edition.
Alguma coisa deu
Lacan, it is enough just to refer to the moment I marked out as a characteristic for the experience of the mirror and paradigmatic of the constitution of the big other. The moment the child turns his head towards this other, capital O. If the relation that he has with the specular image is too captive to the image, for this movement to be possible, listen, it is because the purely dyadic relationship disposes him of his relation to the big other, end of quote. And Lacan precises, if this movement is not possible, you have psychosis. And we can better specify this latter point, you have autism, simply. Lacan adds, this moment, this gesture, is the purest moment of the mirror stage, end of quote, even if he never describes that in his text of 1938. Why these considerations are important? Simply because not only they are clinically important, but also because they show the key role of the mediation and of the big other. There is a big other towards whom the baby turns the head, showing by that the existence in him or her, the symbolic register. Otherwise, without this gesture, the subject remains in the imaginary register, in the dyadic relation, without the symbolic mediation, as says Kojève in his lecture on Hegel. Can I show the first slide, please?
Yes, so just 1 second. So share the screen. So give me one slideshow. Yeah.
Okay. In this sense, allow me to show you a very interesting cognitive diagram created by cognitive sciences, so by Simon Baron-Cohen, where you can see the first couple of eyes on the left, the baby's eyes, and on the right, a square that represent the symbolic world, that is to say, meaning, objects, signifiers, symbols, etc. But you find here the very key point in this diagram. You see below the adult's eyes or someone's eyes. Why? Simply because the diagram shows that the baby is not interested in objects themselves, toys, third person situations, or whatever, but he's interested namely in others' desire. That is to say, what objects, persons, situations mean for the other. A table means a table with its table functionality because this means a table for another. At the same, this schema helps you to coach, to understand what is the notion of manque d'objet, lack of object, simply because you can see that there is no direct relation to object when you are in the symbolic register. Interesting because cognitivists, for example, consider that in autism, where people are not in the symbolic register as such, there is a loss of the object functionality. That is to say, the child is not able to play with the remote control as if it were a toy car, faire semblant. To put it another way, the symbolic register, you don't need actual a toy car to play toy car. I repeat, in the symbolic register, you don't need actual toy car to play toy car because the symbolic register replaces actual toy car. You understand, I hope. I would like the second slide. I would like to show you the very known optical schema designed by Lacan in 1960 and in which, rapport de Daniel Lagage, Lacan insists about the checking back. It's not too hard to see and to understand that is the same schema than cognitivist thinkers, two couples of eyes sharing the same symbolic register, so the big other. Here it is the crucial concept of the optical schema of Lacan if you didn't understand it in the past. Not only Lacan can say humans desire is the desire of the other, but he also has this well-known formula which can appear opaque. The signifier is what represents the subject for another signifier. It is always the same structure of mediation by language. In my opinion, even this idea of Lacan's has its origins in Kojève's definition, which I quote Kojève, pay attention, to desire, the desire of another is therefore in the final analysis to desire that the value that I am or that I represent be the value desired by this other. So practically word for word, Lacan's definition. What's more, it was Raymond Queneau, Kojève's listener and editor, who at the same time as Lacan's formula published a text entitled X takes way for Z, also in the Kojèvian tradition. Once again, the structure of mediation is about all the very possibility of being in a socialized world and by ricochet in a total alienation with others. So maybe we see that it is now about not only a theoretical masturbation here, but rather some very clinical facts, crucial clinical facts in the clinical practice. Until a point that, next slide, please, until a point that even excuse me, I did the comparison with two schemas. No, next slide. Until the point that even the DSM-5 medical and psychiatric bullshit, obviously, even DSM-5 give an importance, excuse me, to this lack of gesture towards the other in the following disorder. This inhibited social engagement disorder bullshit. And the third criteria is absent checking back with adult caregiver after venturing away, and so on and so forth. So you can say the validity, the importance of the Lacan thought, because even the DSM-5, you find this kind of observation described by Lacan in the 50s. What about now, so again, of the notion of mediation? The notion of mediation then comes from Hegel. So comes from Kojève. In the sense of, in the Lacan's work, you must adopt the following rule. When Lacan says Hegel, in fact, he says Kojève. Mediation means simply that there is no bipolar relation without the incidence of the other, without the influence of the third. And again, in the family complex, Lacan continued to read Henri Wallon from Kojève, namely when Lacan takes up Wallon's descriptions of the following behaviors in children, such as seduction, domination, submission, etc. Behaviors very important in Wallon's descriptions in the origin of character in children, a book, very long book. In these descriptions, you find essentially some bipolar relations, as for example, exhibitionism, voyeurism, dominant, submissive, etc. But in fact, as early as 1938, Lacan noted that the bipolar relationship was a secondary notion. I quote, to understand this structure, bipolar relations of seduction, domination, to understand this structure, consider for a moment the child who makes a spectacle of himself and the child who follows him with his eyes. Which is the more spectator-like? Or look at the child who shows his attempts at seduction on another. Where is the seducer? Finally, between the child who enjoys the evidence of his domination and the one who is submitting to it, let's ask ourselves which is the more submissive. End of quote. Very interesting statement of Lacan in the sense that he emphasizes here what? The importance of the mediation. Why? Because in fact, in this bipolar relation, the other, imaginary others, is not the key. Because the key point is a big other. Which one? Precisely the one towards whom the child turns his head. That is to say, not a person, but rather a register, a symbolic register, placing by the desire as a mediation. Lacan will call it ideal ego, so his definition, the point at which he wishes to be satisfied in himself. Le point depuis lequel je me vois, in French. In the same vein, for example, Lacan remarks that in the lesbian sexuality, for example, when two women are in bed, there is always the presence of a man like a kind of witness. So somewhere there is his gaze in the phantasmatic construction, obviously. So there is no bipolar relation as such. And maybe there is no bipolar relation can be considered like a kind of prelude of the famous there is no sexual relation, in the sense of, for example, I don't know, imagine you meet a man or a woman at a party and then go to bed with him or her. The question is very simple. You are not just two in bed. Maybe you are three, okay. But you are not just two, because sexuality itself works as a big other. And it determines everything you can do in bed or whatever. That's why sexuality as such is also a kind of bullshit. But not in the sense of the sexual desire wouldn't be a good thing, but rather in the sense that sexual desire can't exist without an artificial framework, a dispositif, says Foucault. That's why I say you are not just two in bed. Another point, if you allow me, master and slave, another very known Kojèvian topic. This consideration of mediation and desire for the other are not only constitutive of the human being in statu nascendi, they are also at the very heart of Kojève's reading of Hegel, namely the theory of master and slave, because once again, this master-slave relationship can only be conceived in terms of desire and mediation. Master and slave relation only makes sense through mediation. And I even go so far as to say the reciprocal exchange of the places and functions of each of the parties. This alternating change of place, the slave becoming master, the master becoming, in a way, a slave in his relation to the world through the slave, because simply without the slave, he can't eat. I think that they were decisive in the Lacanian conception of transference. Transference were a change, a mutation of places and subjective positions is required. Long story short, the beloved becomes the lover. The neurotic, who is too satisfied in his complaint, becomes hungry for knowledge about his unconscious, on the one hand. On the other hand, the analyst, initially put in the position of wanting to know what's wrong with his neurotic, becomes the one who holds the key to knowledge about his patient's neurosis and repressed desire. In this way, Lacan can read Plato's symposiums and transference through the successive reversals of master and slave roles in what Lacan calls the metaphor of love, métaphore de l'amour. I don't know if everyone here is familiar with the Plato Symposium. In any case, Lacan makes a lengthy commentary on it, pointing out that is the best way of understanding what happens in psychoanalytic transference. At that time, in the seminar of transference, Lacan asked Kojève for his opinion of the symposium. then 20 years after Kojève's lecture on Hegel in the 30s. And Kojève said this enigmatic phrase to Lacan: "You won't understand anything about Plato's Symposium if you don't know why Aristophanes has hiccups." Because at some point, one of the characters, Aristophanes, in Plato's dialogue has hiccups. Lacan says this is a riddle by Kojève and tries to answer the riddle as best he can. But in my opinion, his answer is wrong and unoriginal. I think I found the real answer to Kojève's riddle. And I talk about that in my book about Kojève. Here my point. Starting with Aristophanes' hiccups, Plato's dialogue changed completely, because each character starts speaking in the place of another character. After Aristophanes' hiccups, Eryximachus speaks in the place of Aristophanes, Diotima in the place of Socrates, Socrates in the place of Alcibiades, etc. In short, starting with Aristophanes' hiccups, you realize that Plato's dialogue is structured as a dialectic in which the master becomes the slave, the master becomes the slave of the slave becomes the master, and so on and so forth. That is to say, the true description of transference is in analysis. Because the essential question in transference is that the analysand, placed at the start of the treatment as loved, object of other desire, becomes, after a subjective rectification, lover, Erastes, desiring something that only the analyst possesses. And the analyst, placed at the start of the treatment as a loving, interesting in his patient, becomes the beloved, the desire, in what Lacan calls the metaphor of love. And all this stems from Kojève's dialectic. Here is, according to me, the true response to Kojève's riddle. Let me end with this last point. Kojève clinician. I'd like to talk about one last point, which seems important to me. Here it is. It is thanks to Kojève's characterization of two of Hegel's figures of the mind developed in the 30s that Lacan was able to construct two more or less symptomatic modalities in the subject. Lacan develops, according to me, this major neurosis through the figures of the skeptic and the stoic. To summarize, and quoting Kojève, the skeptic denies the world, but without working. The stoic works, but only in thought, never in action. This cannot fail to remind us of the relationship that Lacan establishes with these two classic neuroses, the obsessive, hence the man, and the hysteric, hence the woman, with respect to terms, work and decision. And this is why Lacan thought that the analyst should be the fruit of both. He, she should be a decided worker. That is to say, a mix of hysteric and obsessive. To summarize, the hysteric is always decided, but she doesn't want to work. On the contrary, the obsessive works all the time, but he never decides. The insatisfaction in the hysterical subject and the alienation to the impossible desire, it is in this way that Lacan characterizes the two most important neuroses. These considerations come from the clinical practice, but also maybe from the influence of Kojève. I finish. saying that between the caprice of a decision with no other consequence than to blame the other for one's own malaise, and the procrastination of working but not making up one's mind, there is what we can call a life. Thank you.